He killed his own master in a government hallway and felt nothing. Not rage, not grief, not the horror that should accompany murdering the person who spent decades shaping you into something worth being. Nothing. The calculation had been run. The master was in the way. The master was removed. That is where this story ends up. But what makes it truly horrifying is not the ending. It is the beginning. Because Exar Kun did not start as a monster. He started as the best student the Jedi Order had ever seen. Think about what that means for a moment. The Order didn't fail him. No one abused him. No one broke him. He was given everything. The finest master, the deepest training, a future so bright that the people around him could barely look at it directly. And he looked at all of it, every last piece of it, and decided it wasn't enough. That is the horror the title is promising you. Not a Sith who was made, a Jedi who chose. What he chose, step by step, world by world, is what we are going to walk through. And by the time we get to the end, you will understand why his name was spoken in whispers for 4,000 years after his death. Why Jedi Masters used his story as the warning above all other warnings. Why a spirit with no body, trapped in stone on a jungle moon, nearly destroyed Luke Skywalker's new order from the inside. You will also understand something that the history books struggle to admit. That the line between the greatest Jedi and the most dangerous Sith is thinner than anyone who has ever worn the robes wanted to believe. There is a kind of evil that the galaxy produces rarely. Not the evil that comes from suffering, from wounds so deep they never healed, from a life of cruelty that hollowed someone out and left something terrible in the empty space. Not the evil of someone who had nothing and took everything in response. Those kinds of evil are almost comprehensible. You can trace the wound. You can follow the scar tissue back to where the damage was done and understand, even if you cannot forgive, how a person ended up where they ended up. What Exar Kun represents is something different, something that has no wound to trace and no scar tissue to examine. He was not made into what he became by circumstance or trauma or the cruelty of others. He was given everything the Jedi Order could offer. He looked at all of it, examined it carefully, understood it completely, and decided it was not enough. He wanted more. He always wanted more. The wanting was what drove him across the galaxy and through the gates of the dark side tradition, and into a transformation that made him something the Order had not faced in centuries. The wanting was also the thing that destroyed him. Eventually, in the way that unlimited appetite always destroys the person who carries it. But the destruction came later. Before the destruction came everything else. What makes his story so difficult to sit with is not what he became. It is how deliberately he became it. The Sith tradition produces many figures who were corrupted, manipulated, pushed over edges they had not meant to approach. Beings who fell because someone else engineered the fall. Beings who embraced the dark side because they were in pain, and the dark side offered relief from the pain, and they did not understand the price until the price had already been paid. These stories are terrible. They are also, in a specific way, easier to hold. You can see the tragedy. You can find the point where the person who could have been saved was not saved. And you can sit with that and understand it. Exar Kun's story does not give you that comfort. There is no manipulation to identify, no master villain pulling his strings toward the dark, no grief or rage that the Order failed to address in time. What there is, instead, is a brilliant mind that looked at the full picture clearly and chose. He understood what the Jedi Code was. He understood what the dark side was. He understood the cost of what he was pursuing with the precision of someone who had studied it theoretically for years before he began pursuing it practically. And he decided that the cost was acceptable and the thing being offered was worth paying the cost for. He was right about the power. He was catastrophically wrong about everything else. He was brought to the Jedi Order young, as most Force-sensitive children were brought. The records of his earliest life before the Order are sparse, in the way those records always are. Jedi taken young enough that the family becomes a background detail rather than a formative one, replaced by the structure and community of the Order itself. What the records do show is that from his first days of training, his masters noticed something exceptional in him, and not exceptional in the way that every Force-sensitive child who makes it to the Order is exceptional. Something beyond the potential the curriculum was designed to develop, something already developed, already reaching for complexity that the standard training was not designed to introduce for years. He was assigned to Master Vodo Siosk Bas, and this assignment was not random. Vodo was a Kravaki of enormous patience and centuries of experience. A being who had trained more apprentices than some masters trained in entire careers, and who had developed through that accumulation of experience the ability to look at a young student and see not just what they were, but what the particular shape of their gifts and limitations was going to make of them. He looked at Exar Kun and saw something that should have produced the greatest Jedi of his generation. He also saw something underneath that worried him. Not a flaw in the obvious sense. Not an emotional wound or a gap in some fundamental capacity. Something more subtle than those things. A quality in the boy's relationship with power that was not quite right, in a way that Vodo could feel clearly and articulate only imperfectly. He tried to articulate it anyway. In conversations with other masters, in private meditations, in the increasingly urgent warnings he gave his student as the years passed, and the quality he had noticed did not diminish with training the way most concerning qualities diminish with good training. The Jedi Code, Vodo explained, was built in part to address exactly this kind of nature, the hunger for more, the dissatisfaction with limitation, the sense that the approved path was too small for the scope of what one could achieve. Most students who arrived with this quality moved through it. They came, eventually, to understand what the code's structure was protecting them from, why the walls of the curriculum existed, what lay on the other side of those walls that made them necessary. They found the peace and serenity the code described, and they built their lives around it, and they became fine Jedi Knights and Masters who did good work and died with clean hands and quiet minds. Exar Kun did not move through it. He moved alongside it the way a river moves alongside a bank, contained by the structure but always running at full pressure against it, always feeling the wall, always looking for the place where the bank was weak enough to give. He had many gifts, and the one that defined his early training was not his force ability, though that was considerable. It was intelligence. The quality of his mind, applied to any problem it was given, was exceptional in a way that went beyond mere cleverness or academic aptitude. He did not just learn things. He understood them, fully and immediately, in the way that people who were designed to understand specific kinds of things understand them when they encounter them. Combat forms that took most students months of repetition to internalize, Kun internalized in days. historical accounts of Jedi strategy and Force technique, texts that other students read and retained as information, Kun read and retained as working knowledge he could apply and extend immediately. He was built to receive and process and use the things the Order was teaching him, and the result was a student who accelerated through every level of the curriculum with a speed that his masters found impressive, and that Vodo found, beneath the admiration, quietly alarming. The sparring sessions on Dantooine became something that the other students attended the way they might attend a demonstration rather than a competition. He would take on multiple opponents simultaneously and defeat them not through aggression or recklessness, but through a precision of analysis that operated at a different speed than his opponents were capable of matching. He could read the way a fight was moving before it moved there. He could see the options available to an opponent and close them off before the opponent had decided which one to take. He fought with the focused calm of someone solving a problem they found interesting rather than someone in a combat situation with real stakes. That calm was the part that made the other students most uncomfortable, without most of them being able to articulate exactly why. He did not celebrate after victories. He did not perform for the watching students. He simply competed until the competition was over, and then turned to his master and asked, what came next? Always, what comes next? The question with another question underneath it, the one he never asked directly. Is there something harder than this? Is there something more than this? Tell me this is not as far as the approved path goes. Vodo gave him everything the Order permitted him to give. Advanced forms years ahead of where most students at his level were working. Force techniques from the curriculum's upper reaches, typically reserved for students far older. Historical accounts of the greatest Jedi Masters and the conflicts that had defined them. Kun devoured everything at the same rate, with the same focused efficiency, and came back, looking exactly as he had looked when he arrived. Hungry, always with the look of someone who has received a substantial meal, and found it simply confirmed that they were capable of eating much more. The Jedi Archive on Dantooine was not the galaxy's most comprehensive. The Great Library on Ossus held far more, and the Temple on Coruscant more still. But the Dantooine Archive held what it held, and buried within all of that, in the oldest and least trafficked section, stored with the institutional reluctance of an organization that had not quite managed to destroy something it probably should have destroyed, were fragments. Remnants of a tradition the Order had spent centuries trying to eliminate from the galaxy's collective memory. Sith texts, ancient ones, transcribed partially and translated incompletely, stripped of enough context that they functioned as suggestions of a tradition rather than instructions in it, but real enough that someone with the right mind and the right inclination could follow the suggestion to something larger. Exar Kun found them the way predators find prey, not by searching obvious places, but by following something instinctive, a pull toward the restricted sections, toward the oldest shelves, toward the texts with worn bindings and faded script that most students walked past without slowing. He read them in full. Then he read them again. And what he found was not darkness in the way the Order's teachings described darkness, not the absence of virtue or the corruption of something good. What he found was possibility, the outline of an answer to a question that had been forming in him since his earliest days of training. The question of why the Force needed to be approached so carefully, why the full depth of what the Force could do was treated as inherently dangerous rather than inherently available, why the Jedi philosophy was organized around restraint rather than around exploration of what was actually there. The Sith had understood something about the Force that the Jedi Code actively suppressed. The Force was not gentle by nature. It was not inherently devoted to the light or to the values the Order associated with the light side. It was power, vast, ancient, impartial power that had existed before the Jedi and would exist after them, and did not, in any fundamental way, care what they thought about the right way to use it. And the Sith had developed a relationship with that power that was more honest about its nature. They did not approach the Force as something to be channeled carefully through a series of approved techniques. They grasped it. They imposed their will upon it. They demanded rather than surrendered. And the techniques they had developed through thousands of years of that approach were categorically different from anything in the Jedi curriculum. More powerful in certain specific and crucial ways. More honest, more complete. He read every fragment the archive held. He had them memorized within weeks, could feel the shape of the full tradition the fragments implied, even in the places the texts did not explicitly describe, could sense the gaps the way you sense the shape of a word you have forgotten by feeling the space where it should be. He began asking Vodo questions that made the old master go very still. Questions about ancient Sith rituals. Questions about whether the distinction between light and dark was a philosophical construct or a physical reality. Questions about why certain techniques had been sealed in the archive rather than simply not taught. The questions Vodo refused to answer were more informative than the ones he answered. They told Kun exactly where to look next. Vodo saw where his student was moving, and he tried everything he knew how to try, which was considerable. He sat with Kun in the evenings and talked about the history of Jedi who had been drawn toward the dark side. He described what happened to them, not as abstraction or warning, as account. Specific beings who had been exactly as gifted as Kun, who had felt exactly the same pull toward the full depth of what the Force contained, and who had followed that pull to specific and terrible ends. He explained what the Code's walls protected against, what the dark side took from those who embraced it, how the power it offered was real, and how the cost was realer than the power. The darkness gives generously, Vodo told him, and then it takes everything back. That is always the bargain. That has always been the bargain. Kun listened with the same focused attention he gave to everything. He processed his master's arguments with the precision of an excellent mind that has already decided how it is going to respond to a case before the case is presented. He acknowledged the history. He acknowledged the cost. He did not argue. He did not push back. He simply went quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when they have already made a decision and no longer see the point of the conversation they are in. And then he went back to the archive and kept reading. The breaking point, when it came, did not look like a breaking point from the outside. There was no confrontation, no rupture, no visible moment where everything changed. It was cumulative. Every time Vodo said no, every time the code structure blocked a direction Kun wanted to move, every time he felt the dark side at the edge of his awareness, pressing against the Jedi training the way a tide presses against a seawall, and turned back from it into the approved techniques and felt the gap between what the training offered and what he knew was waiting just past its walls. He was not angry at Vodo. He did not feel betrayed by the Order. He had moved past those emotions to something cooler and more resolute. A conclusion. The path the Jedi were showing him was not the path he was going to walk. What he needed was not anywhere in Dantooine's curriculum. It was somewhere else. And the fragments had told him where. He left without asking permission. He did not leave an explanation or an apology. He did not send word to his master or to any member of the council. He had been explaining himself for years to people who were not going to understand. And the explanations had accomplished nothing except to give Vodo additional information about which direction to push back from. He was done with explanations. He was done with the walls. He left. The coordinates he had committed to memory months earlier, extracted from the fragments over weeks of careful work, pointed to the Onderon system, a world on the edge of outer rim space, with a history so thoroughly soaked in dark side influence that even the wildlife had been changed by it. Centuries of force energy reshaping the fauna of a moon that orbited it into something larger and more dangerous than biology alone should have produced. Onderon had been shaped by one man more than any other, Freeden Nad, a Jedi master from centuries past who had sought out Sith teachings, mastered them completely, crowned himself king of Onderon, and built a dynasty on dark side power that had lasted until the Jedi Order finally dismantled it. When Nad died, he had not gone the way most beings go. He had remained as a spirit, anchored to the places and artifacts that had defined his power in life, waiting in the dark side tradition for whatever came next. What orbited Onderon was Dixun, a jungle moon, a world that Nad had used as his center of dark side operations, building there a collection of temples and storage sites and ritual locations that the jungle had partially consumed in the centuries since, but had not destroyed. The dark side energy Nad and his followers had built into those structures was not the kind of thing that time eroded. It was the kind of thing that time deepened. The fragments had described what was there: artifacts, knowledge, doors into the Sith, tradition that the Jedi had never found, and that the jungle had kept sealed while it grew over the stones. He made his way to the Onderon system alone and spent the journey turning the fragmentary knowledge over in his mind, mapping the gaps, building from the pieces a picture of what he was heading toward and what he needed to do when he arrived. He was not approaching this as an adventure. He was approaching it the way he approached every problem of sufficient complexity, as a system to be understood and navigated with precision and care. What he found when he arrived was Dixun, dense and green and old beyond easy reckoning, the jungle pressing against the ruins of Nad's old structures from every direction simultaneously, roots cracking stone that had stood for generations, vines pulling at walls that had been built by force-sensitive hands to specifications that most architectural traditions would not have used. But underneath the jungle's slow, patient work of reclamation, the dark side energy was intact. More than intact, richer for the centuries, pressed into the stone the way heat presses into metal left in sunlight, except that what had heated this stone was not sunlight. It was ritual. Sustained dark side practice over decades had permeated the material at a molecular level, making the energy not just present in the ruins but structural, as much a property of the stone as its hardness. Kun stood at the edge of the first ruin complex and felt it pressing against his awareness the way the fragments had promised it would. Not the diluted, almost academic trace of dark side energy that existed in the hidden texts of Dantooine's archive. The living version, the thing itself, present and immediate and recognizably the same as what the fragments had been describing. The way a living person is recognizably the same as a description of them. This was real. Everything the texts had pointed toward was real. He had been right to come. He moved through the ruins with the care of someone who understood that structures built by Sith practitioners were not simply buildings but designed objects with specific functions, and often still functional long after their designers were gone. Traps, mechanisms, ward structures built into the architecture itself that could activate under the right conditions or the wrong ones. He worked through them with the Force, reading the dark side, engineering the way an experienced reader reads text, understanding the intention and structure before committing to action. He had spent enough time with Sith theory to recognize the methodologies. He did not touch anything he had not already understood. He moved deeper into the complex, one chamber at a time, methodical and unhurried, following the pull of the Force toward the places where the energy was densest. The wildlife of Dixun found him before he found the oldest sections of the ruins. The fauna of the moon had been shaped by centuries of dark side influence into something that was not quite what its genetics should have produced. Larger, more aggressive, more difficult to kill, and responding to the Force presence of a Force-sensitive being, not with the avoidance that predators on most worlds displayed when confronted with Jedi, but with something more complicated, part threat assessment, part attraction, the dark side energy that radiated from any trained Force user reading, in the particular ecosystem Dixun had become, as a challenge rather than a deterrent. He dealt with what came at him. It was not easy, and it cost him time he would rather have spent on the ruins, but the Jedi combat training that the Order had given him was comprehensive, and the Force amplified it, and the creatures of Dixun, for all their dark side enhancement, were ultimately operating on instinct rather than intelligence. He moved through the encounters with the efficiency of someone who had spent years learning to end conflicts quickly, and he kept moving toward what the Force was pointing him at. The Beast Riders found him 3 days in. They emerged from the tree line without announcement, which was the most unsettling thing about it. Dozens of them, heavily armed, moving with the practiced coordination of people who had been operating in this specific terrain for generations and had developed through that experience the economy of movement of those who have never wasted effort in a place that punishes waste. They had the particular look of people who have never encountered a situation that violence could not resolve. They surrounded him in the methodical way of beings who were very good at surrounding things, and they looked at him the way the creatures of Dixun had looked at him, as something that needed to be categorized and then dealt with according to its category. He fought them. He was a trained Jedi warrior who had spent more years in sparring sessions than most trained warriors spent in actual combat. And the skills those sessions had built were genuine and considerable. He hurt them. He hurt them significantly enough that for the first period of the encounter, the math was working in his favor. But the math of a single fighter against dozens of experienced fighters in their own terrain has a way of eventually shifting, regardless of how good the single fighter is. And it shifted. The injuries accumulated. His options narrowed. When the blow finally landed that took him off his feet and put him on the jungle floor of Dixun with his vision fragmented and his body reporting damage that his mind was still trying to process, he was looking up at the ruins he had spent 3 days trying to reach, and the Beast Riders closing in to finish it. And the dark side spoke, not in words, not as a voice or a vision, as something more immediate and less ambiguous than either of those things. The dark side energy that had been soaked into the ruins and the soil and the air of Doksun for centuries reached out toward the living, force-sensitive being, lying in the clearing at the exact moment when that being was close enough to pound the edge of his resources that the reaching could find purchase. Not a threat, not a temptation, in the way Jedi training described temptation, as something to be resisted, a fact, a door, an option that had always been present and was making itself known now because now was when he needed to know about it. The Jedi curriculum had told him what would happen if he crossed this threshold. The wrongness, the corruption, the soul-deep sense of having done something that could not be undone. He had heard it from Vodo and from every master who had touched on the subject in years of training, all of them describing the same experience, the horror of it. He took the hand, the dark side extended, and felt none of those things. What he felt was clarity. The force lightning that erupted from him in the next several seconds was not something he had ever practiced. The Jedi curriculum did not teach force lightning. The Sith fragments had described it theoretically as a technique that required dark side alignment to execute. The knowledge of it had apparently been in him all along, waiting behind the code's prohibition the way water waits behind a dam. When the prohibition came down, the knowledge was simply available. The way any knowledge becomes available when the wall that was blocking it is removed. He used it with the instinctive precision of someone who had been built for exactly this kind of application and had only been prevented from discovering it by the wrong framework. The beast riders who had not yet run, ran now. The ones who did not run did not require further engagement. Kun lay on the jungle floor of Exar afterward and looked at his hands. He felt the dark side moving through him in a way he had no prior reference for. Not the subtle edge of it that he had always felt at the margin of his Jedi connection, the thing his training had taught him to notice and step back from. The current itself. He expected horror. He had been told very specifically, and by very experienced masters, what to expect when the code broke this completely. He looked for the wrongness. He waited for the corruption. He searched himself for the thing that every account of this moment described as present and unmistakable. Instead, he felt clean, more precisely himself than he had felt in years, as if the thing that the code's walls had been framing as a danger was actually a constraint, and the constraint had come off, and the self that remained after the constraint was removed was more fully his self than the constrained version had been. He would examine this later. For now, he had work to continue. The beast riders gave him space after that. The threat reassessment that had happened in the clearing communicated itself to the rest of them. In whatever way threat information communicated through their culture, and the result was that the rest of his time on Deksun was not interrupted. He went deeper into the ruins over the following days. The dark side guided him with a clarity it had not had before, now that the wall between his awareness and its current was gone. Not the vague pull he had followed from the fragments. A direction. Here. This way. Go further. He found the amulet in a sealed chamber that he opened after hours of careful work on the lock mechanisms. The chamber was very old. The air inside it stale in the particular way of spaces sealed for a very long time. The amulet sat on a pedestal at the center, surrounded by inscriptions that described what it was and what it had been built for. Sith work, not decorative, functional, designed to deepen and amplify the force connection of whoever wore it, to serve as a conduit between the wearer and the Sith dark side tradition, the ruins had been built to preserve. An anchor, a key, a tool that was looking for the right hand to pick it up. He put it on, and the dark side energy of the ruins became immediately and dramatically present in a way it had not been before, as if the amulet were a lens and everything he had been sensing through the blur of an unfocused connection was now sharp and immediate. He stood in the sealed chamber and felt the full scope of what these ruins had been built to hold, what had been worked into the stone over generations of Sith practice, the tradition Freedon Nad had built here and left behind for whoever came looking with the access to claim it. And then Freedon Nad's spirit spoke, not from the ruins, from the place that very old and very invested spirits inhabit. When they choose not to dissolve into the force at death, the presence was cold and ancient and deeply aware. Nothing like the warm, active presence of a living being, and nothing like the warm, latent presence of the force that Jedi connection described. Cold the way old stone is cold. Present in the way that things which have been present for a very long time become simply part of the atmosphere of a place, watching him, assessing him, with something that was not quite approval and not quite interest, but occupied the space where those things would be, in a being who still had feelings in the ordinary sense. You found your way here, the spirit communicated, in the way ancient spirits communicate, which bypasses the imprecision of language and goes directly to meaning. That alone is more than most who have tried managed. But what you are looking for is not fully here. This is the beginning. There is more, and further, and deeper beyond this. The full tradition cannot be taken from fragments and artifacts. It must be given by those who held it. Through the methods the tradition prescribes for its own transmission, and the methods will cost you things you have not yet been asked to give. Kun did not ask what those things were. He had learned enough about how the dark side tradition worked to understand that asking that question too early was a form of weakness the tradition had no patience for. The cost would make itself known when it was time for it to make itself known. What mattered now was the direction the spirit gave it. Korriban, the ancient Sith homeworld, the valley where the most powerful dark side practitioners in the history of the galaxy had been entombed with their knowledge and their accumulated power and the expectation, built into the very architecture of their burial sites, that someone would come eventually, someone with the dark side alignment and the genuine preparation to receive what the tombs held. Freedon Nad's spirit could give Kun the outer edge of the tradition. The depths were in the tombs, held by presences far older and far more fully realized than Nad. He would need to go there. He left Dexon with the amulet and a direction, and the clear particular feeling of someone who has spent years moving toward something and is finally moving toward it at the speed it deserves. Korriban appeared on the view screen as a world of dead red stone and silence, so old it had become a quality of the atmosphere. Even from orbit, the dark side was not subtle here. It did not present itself the way it had on Deek Sun, alive and growing and dynamic under the jungle's surface. Here it was geological, layered. The accumulated weight of everything that had been done on this world over thousands of years of Sith occupation, the accumulated power of every Dark Lord who had lived and died and been entombed in the valley below. The force pressed against Kun's awareness from the planet's surface with a density that had no equivalent in his experience. Not overwhelming, recognizable. The same current he had felt on Deek Sun, amplified by a factor that required recalibration. He landed in the Valley of the Dark Lords, and the wind off the bluffs was dry and cold, and carried the smell of old stone and something beneath old stone that was not quite a smell but occupied the same awareness. He stood at the valley's entrance and looked at the tombs carved into the rock face. Enormous structures built at a scale that was not about practicality and never had been. You do not need a structure 100 meters tall to hold the remains of a single being. You build at that scale to communicate something. These tombs said, in stone that had been absorbing dark side energy for millennia, that the beings interred within them had bent the galaxy to their will while they lived and required this much stone to appropriately contain the memory of it. He recognized the names above the doorways from the fragments. Ludo, Kresh, Tulak, Horde, Ajunta, Pal, the first of the Dark Lords, Marka Ragnos, whose empire had set the template for everything that followed and whose death had preceded the great hyperspace war that shattered it. Each name was a chapter in the history that the Jedi Order had spent centuries trying to suppress, treating the knowledge of it not as something to be understood, but as something to be sealed away from future generations, as if the history would be less dangerous if no one knew it, as if the tradition could be killed by refusing to acknowledge that it existed. He walked among the tombs without hesitation. The dark side watched him in the particular way that very old and very powerful force concentrations watch beings who are not afraid of them. Not with malevolence, with something closer to recognition. The tombs had been built with protections designed by practitioners who were very good at building things that killed the uninvited. Trap mechanisms integrated into the architecture. Ward structures woven into the stone at the level of its construction rather than added afterward. The kinds of things that the Jedi curriculum had never described, because the Jedi curriculum operated on the assumption that its students would never be in a position to need that description. Kun worked through them with the Force reading the dark side, engineering the way an expert reader reads text in a language they are still learning. He understood enough to proceed. He understood enough to not make the mistakes that had ended the less prepared beings who had come here before him. The inner chambers opened to him, and he moved through them in the near darkness, the Force lighting his path through corridors that had been sealed for longer than the current Republic had existed. The inscriptions on the walls were in Old Sith, the same language he had encountered in the fragments, and that the Force was now translating with increasing fluency, feeding understanding directly into the part of his mind where understanding lived, rather than routing it through the slower process of conscious decoding. The spirits of the ancient dead were present. Not all of them. The very oldest had faded below the level of coherent presence, become more atmosphere than entity, more a quality of the place than an inhabiting consciousness. But the ones that mattered were there. The ones that had accumulated enough dark side power in life that death had not been able to fully dissolve what they were. They existed in the chambers, the way the inscriptions existed in the stone. A record, a presence, something that had been here long enough that it had become part of the structure of the place. What they showed him reorganized everything he thought he already understood. The Jedi texts had described the Sith tradition as a corruption, a deviation from the natural right relationship between Force users and the living energy of the galaxy. The framing of one side of a genuine philosophical dispute presented as objective fact, the way the winning side of any philosophical dispute tends to present its position when it has the institutional power to control what gets preserved and what gets sealed away. What the ancient presences in the tombs showed him was the actual other side of the argument, not the caricature version the sealed archive fragments had sketched. The full position, the complete case, The dark side was not a corruption of the light side. They were not two halves of the same thing, with one half being a deviation from the other. They were two fundamentally different methodologies for engaging with the same power. Two different answers to the same primary question that any force-sensitive being who thought seriously about the Force eventually arrived at. What is the Force, and what is the right relationship to have with it? The Jedi answered with the code. Surrender to the Force. Serve it. Allow it to move through you the way water moves through a vessel. Accept its guidance. Make yourself transparent so that what comes through you is the Force's will rather than your own. That methodology produced the Jedi. It produced beings of genuine virtue and considerable power who did real good in the galaxy for thousands of years. The Sith answered differently. The Force is power, and power responds to will. You do not surrender to power. You impose your will upon it. You are not its vessel, you are its wielder. That methodology produced techniques and understandings that the Jedi, through their deliberate and comprehensive suppression of the tradition, had made inaccessible. Inaccessible but not destroyed, because you cannot destroy knowledge by refusing to teach it. You can only force it to find other ways to persist. The Sith had been careful to ensure that their knowledge found those ways. Korriban was one of them. Khun stood in the depths of the ancient tombs and absorbed what the presences there had spent their lifetimes accumulating and their deaths preserving, and it settled into him with the same efficiency that everything else had always settled into him. Organized, mapped, understood in its structure and its implications. He was not yet the master of it. He was the inheritor of it, the beginning of the next step in a transmission chain that had been interrupted by the Great Hyperspace War and the collapse of the old Sith Empire, and had been waiting in these tombs for someone to restart it. Freedon Nad's spirit was with him through this. And it was here, in the depths of the most ancient tombs, that the spirit described the next step. Yavin 4, a jungle moon in the outer rim, orbiting a gas giant vast enough to be nearly a star itself. The Massassi lived there, a people descended from ancient Sith warriors that the Dark Lord, Naga Sado, had transplanted to the moon millennia ago, conditioning them over generations into something that existed specifically to serve the dark side tradition and to wait for someone who could arrive and use what they had preserved. The temples the Massassi had built under Sado's direction and maintained through generations of ritual since were one of the most powerful dark side nexuses in the known galaxy. Not the ancient geological power of Korriban. Something more immediate, living. The force energy of countless Massassi rituals accumulated in stone that had been built specifically to hold it. And in those temples, Nad told him, was the ritual that would complete what had begun on Dion. The transmission of the full Sith tradition required more than artifacts and spirits and the direct knowledge transfer that the Korriban presences had provided. It required a specific kind of entry, the kind that only a specific kind of threshold could produce. Yavin 4 was where that threshold existed. He went. The moon appeared green and ancient through the viewport, its jungle surface continuous from horizon to horizon, the stone temples rising above the tree line in places like monuments to intention. He entered the atmosphere and felt the dark side shift around him in a way that was different from either Dixun or Korriban. Not cold, not geological, alive, dynamic, The accumulated force energy of generations of Massassi ritual pressed against his awareness from every direction simultaneously, with the relentless quality of something that had been building for a very long time and had not found an end of springs, adequate container yet. The Massassi emerged from the jungle before he had gone 50 meters from his landing point. Large beings, red-skinned, shaped over generations by a combination of genetics and dark side exposure into something that communicated physical danger even standing still. They moved with the economy of apex predators in their own territory, surrounding him without rushing, assessing him with the flat, measuring look of things that had learned to be careful about what they attacked before attacking it. The amulet changed the assessment. They recognized it. Not intellectually, not by matching it against a catalogue of historical knowledge, in the deep, instinctive way that beings conditioned across generations to recognize symbols of specific power. Recognize what they are looking at. The amulet was Sith, old Sith. The kind of Sith that the entire structure of the Massassi's existence and religious practice had been built around the possibility of encountering. The stranger wearing it was, by that recognition, something that required a different category. They took him to the temples without hostility and without conversation. They did not need conversation. Neither did he. The main temple complex was enormous in a way that the mind had to work to process correctly. The individual structures were tall enough that the tree line did not compete with them. The stone had been worn by millennia of tropical climate, but remained fundamentally intact, standing with the particular permanence of things built by beings who understood that permanence was a requirement rather than a preference. The dark side inside was denser than anywhere outside, much denser. It pressed against awareness from every surface simultaneously, the accumulated ritual energy of the Massassi saturating the stone the way heat saturates metal, not pressing in a hostile way, the way deep water presses against the body of a swimmer, constantly, from all directions, requiring constant accommodation. Friedenad's spirit arrived in the chamber with him and described the ritual. What it required was the threshold, the physical approach to the boundary between living and not living, close enough that the force connection a being maintains from earliest training, the warm, constant, ambient presence of the living galaxy that every Jedi knew as the context of their connection to the Force, went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The way a voice goes silent rather than the way it fades. Because at that proximity to death, the living force could not reach clearly enough to maintain the connection. And in the silence, the dark side would extend itself fully. Not the partial access he had found on Dion. Not the tradition knowledge the Korriban spirits had transmitted. The full current. The unrestricted depth. What the ritual would extract from him in exchange was the surrender that only the edge of death could produce. Genuine. Unconditional. The kind that cannot be strategic. He stood in the chamber and understood the architecture of what he was being offered, which was also the architecture of what was being done to him. The entire sequence from Dexun to Korriban to here had been constructed to arrive at this moment, not because the dark side tradition was incapable of simply transmitting itself to beings who sought it, but because the specific kind of surrender the ritual required could not be performed by calculation. It had to come from somewhere that calculation could not reach. The edge of death was that somewhere. He was being maneuvered. He understood this completely and without ambiguity. He had been maneuvered since Dizun by a sequence of events designed to bring him to this specific point in this specific condition. Nad's spirit had served as the mechanism of that maneuvering, guiding him from place to place with the appearance of teaching while actually positioning him for this moment. He understood all of it. He lay down in the ritual circle anyway, because being maneuvered toward a real thing did not change the reality of the thing. The power the ritual would deliver was not a manipulation. It was what the fragments had described, confirmed by Dixon and by the Korriban tombs, confirmed by everything he had felt moving through him since the amulet went on his wrist. The tradition was real. The power was real. Accepting that he was being maneuvered toward it did not require him to reject it. It required him to accept that the cost of his clarity of vision about the situation was paid in advance rather than deferred. He saw what was happening and chose it. That was honest. Perhaps more honest than the beings who had not seen what was happening and had chosen the same thing without knowing they were choosing it. The Masashi began their ritual, and the dark side energy in the chamber moved in a way that had no equivalent in his experience of force technique. They were not force-sensitive in the conventional sense. They did not use the force the way Jedi or Sith practitioners used it. They were channels, conduits built by generations of conditioning into something that could focus and amplify and direct the ambient dark side energy of the temple toward a specific purpose. They knew what they were doing the way a river knows where it is going. Not through understanding, but through nature. The threshold arrived not as approach, but as arrival. One breath, the force connection was present. The next, it was gone. Not fading, gone. The warm, constant, ambient presence of the living galaxy that had been the background of his entire existence as a force-sensitive being simply stopped. And what remained in its absence was not nothing, not the neutral emptiness of ordinary unconsciousness, but something. The absence of the force was not a vacuum. It was a presence of its own, cold and enormous and very still, and looking at him from the other side of the threshold with the flat, patient attention of something that had been waiting here for a very long time, for exactly this. Take this, or do not, and do not remain. No calculation, no weighing, no strategic consideration of options. The threshold had stripped all of those away the way death strips away everything that is not the essential. What was left was the choice itself. Without the scaffolding, that choice usually comes wrapped in. He chose. He was back in his body on the temple floor, with the dark side moving through him in a way that had no prior point of reference. Not the force lightning of Dixon, not the tradition knowledge of Korriban's tombs, not the amplified sensitivity of the amulet. The thing itself, the full current of the dark side tradition, transmitted not as information or technique, but as direct, living contact with the depth that the Sith had spent thousands of years accessing, and the Jedi had spent the same period trying to pretend did not exist. It moved through him the way a river moves through a landscape that was shaped for it, completely, without restriction. He sat up. Every Masashi in the chamber went to their knees simultaneously, not because he commanded them, because what radiated from him in the minutes after the ritual completed was the thing their entire existence had been built around the possibility of recognizing. The North, their conditioning had been oriented toward for generations without anything to point at. He was now that thing. He was what the temples had been waiting for. He stood in the main chamber of the great temple on Yavin 4, and breathed and felt what he had become and understood immediately that there was something remaining. Freeden Nad's spirit had served as guide, had pointed him toward Dixon, and then Korriban, and then here, had served as the mechanism of transmission for everything the Sith tradition had to offer through indirect means, had done its work. The spirit's presence now was a different kind of thing than it had been on Dixon or in the Korriban tombs. It had been teacher and guide and intermediary. Those functions were complete. The dark side tradition that lived in Kun now was his, not Nad's. He was the current inheritor, not the apprentice of a ghost. The next step in a transmission chain that Nad had served. The Sith tradition had its patterns. The relationship between teacher and student in the dark side did not terminate with the completion of the teaching the way it sometimes terminated in Jedi tradition. It terminated with the superseding of the teacher by the student. Nad had learned from Naga Sado's knowledge and had carried the tradition forward. Kun had now received it and would carry it further. The pattern that structured this transfer was not a pattern of gratitude. What Nad had done to Naga Sado's lingering presence, when that presence had outlived its usefulness, Kun understood to do now. The destruction of Freeden Nad's spirit was not a long process. The full depth of dark side access the ritual had opened included the technique, the way it had always included the techniques the tradition carried. The knowledge was there the moment he reached for it. He applied it with the focused precision he brought to everything, and the spirit of Freeden Nad, which had moved through Sith space for centuries and had guided multiple beings toward the dark side tradition, and had endured long enough to find one worthy of being the last thing it guided, came apart under the pressure Kun applied. It dispersed. It was gone. Exar Kun stood alone in the great temple on Yavin 4 and felt the silence the spirit's absence left, and in that silence made the declaration that the ritual and everything that had led to it had been building toward. He was not a fallen Jedi. He was not a dark side practitioner in the vague, provisional sense of someone who had made some choices and followed some paths that the Jedi Order would not have approved of. He was the Dark Lord of the Sith, not in aspiration, not in philosophical orientation, in the full and complete and tradition-confirmed meaning of the title that the most powerful dark side practitioners in galactic history had held. The lineage had been broken for centuries, shattered along with the old Sith Empire in the Great Hyperspace War. He was not continuing it. He was restarting it. Here, now. With everything, the ritual and the tombs and the fragments and years of reaching toward this had given him. The golden mask came after, built with the Masasi's craft knowledge and his dark side force shaping, worked metal, turned into something that was simultaneously object and statement. The mask covered the upper half of his face, gold, communicating nothing that required elaboration. Anyone with force sensitivity would feel what had gone into its making. Anyone without it would feel the simpler thing the mask was designed to communicate by design. This is not decoration. Do not make that mistake. He wore it and stood in the temple and looked at everything that surrounded him and thought about what came next. He was the Dark Lord of the Sith. The Masasi served him. The full depth of the Sith dark side tradition was his to practice and to extend. He had power and knowledge that the Jedi Order had spent centuries trying to make permanently inaccessible. He had achieved what he had left Dantooine to achieve, what he had followed the fragments toward, what he had followed Nad's spirit toward, and then superseded Nad's spirit in claiming this was everything the beginning had pointed toward. It was a beginning, That was the point. That was always the point. He had not been building toward an ending. He had been building toward a foundation, a ground on which everything that the Sith tradition at its peak had been could be rebuilt. He had not come to the dark side to exist in a temple on an obscure moon in the Outer Rim with the Massassi kneeling to him. He had come here to restart something that the galaxy had forgotten and that the galaxy needed to be reminded of in terms it would not be able to misunderstand or dismiss or seal away in a restricted archive and pretend had never existed. The Republic was out there, operating on the assumption that the great threats were historical, that the darkness had been catalogued and contained, that the Sith tradition was a museum piece, something to study from the safe distance of texts that had been stripped of their most dangerous content before they were stored in the deepest sections of the least visited archives. That assumption was wrong. He was the proof that it was wrong, and a proof that remained in a jungle temple on Yavin 4 was not doing anything except existing. He needed what the galaxy could give him: partners, resources, followers, who were not the Massassi, who were something the galaxy had not seen in centuries. Genuine Sith practitioners, trained in the tradition, capable of serving as an extension of a restored dark side order rather than as primitive ritual servants of an ancient and barely preserved one. The Jedi Order was full of candidates. He had seen this from the archive fragments and from his own years of training. Young beings of genuine force, ability, who had been brought into the Order and trained in the code and given the structure of Jedi tradition as their framework, and some of whom were sitting inside that structure and feeling the walls exactly the way he had felt them. Not all of them. Most of them had found their peace with the structure, or would find it eventually, but some of them were at the edge of the walls right now, feeling the limitation, feeling the hunger that the code had no procedure for satisfying. Those ones were reachable. He needed something else first. The Sith tradition at its operational peak was not a single practitioner with an army of Massassi. It was a structure, a Dark Lord of the Sith, and an apprentice. The two together functioning as the active core around which the broader organization of the dark side's power in the galaxy was built. He needed someone who could serve that function, someone powerful enough to be genuinely useful and broken enough in the right ways to be shaped. The reports that reached Yavin 4 told a clear enough story. The Krath, the dark side cult rising from Empress Teta's system, and threaded through the reports about the Krath. The story of a Jedi Knight who had walked into that darkness, not by choice, but by fall, by grief, by the collapse of everything he had tried to protect, by the particular damage that happens to beings of strong conviction when the thing they were convinced was worth protecting is taken from them. Ulic Qel-Droma, a Jedi of considerable force ability who had gone to the Krath to stop them from the inside and had been stopped instead, corrupted by Sith poison and manipulation, and the particular vulnerability of someone whose commitment to what they were protecting was so complete that removing the object of the commitment left nothing stable enough to stand on. Two kinds of darkness: the cold, deliberate, calculated kind that Kun embodied, the hot, ragged, desperate kind that Qel-Droma had fallen into. Different in nature, complementary in function. Together, more than either was separately. He sent the message through channels that only someone who understood what they were looking at would recognize as a message, an invitation without elaboration. Come find me. I see what you have become. I know what you are capable of. And I will show you what that capability is actually for. The galaxy was still living in its comfortable assumption, still operating on the belief that the worst of what the Sith had been was history, that the dark side tradition was finished, and that the darkness gathering in the Empress Theta system and on Onderon and in the places where ambitious beings without Jedi training had found Sith artifacts and begun working with them was a new and separate thing, not connected to anything older or deeper. They were wrong about all of it. The tradition had not ended. It had been waiting, and now it was ready to announce that it was done waiting, in the specific and permanent and utterly unmistakable terms that only a genuine great Sith war could provide. Exar Kun stood in his temple with the golden mask on his face, and the dark side moving through him like a current through a landscape built to carry it, and waited for Ulic Qel-Droma to arrive. When he did, the galaxy was going to begin understanding something it had been allowed to forget for far too long. The forgetting was over. Ulic Qel-Droma arrived on Yavin 4. The way broken things arrive places they were not planning to go. Not with intention, exactly. With the particular momentum of someone who has run out of other options and is following the last signal still transmitting in the noise of everything that has collapsed. He was not the man the Jedi Council had sent into the Krath. That man had gone in with a plan and a conviction and the specific kind of confidence that comes from believing you understand the danger you are walking into. What came out of the Krath months later was something else. Someone whose plan had not survived contact with the poison they had put into him, whose conviction had eroded under weeks of sustained alchemical assault on the chemistry of thought and feeling, whose confidence had been redirected by the woman who understood how to take a man's certainty about himself and turn it into a weapon against everything he was trying to protect. He had fallen. He knew he had fallen. The thing that makes Ulic Qel-Droma's story particularly difficult is that the knowledge did not produce in him what the Jedi curriculum said it was supposed to produce. The recognition of darkness was supposed to be the beginning of the return toward light. You saw where you were. You understood how you got there. You reached back toward the training and the connection and the community that the dark side had drawn you away from. That was the mechanism the Order had been teaching for generations. That was how you came back. Qel-Droma recognized where he was and did not reach back. What he reached for instead was the thing that had survived the collapse of everything else. The only quality of himself that the Krath poison and Alima Keto's manipulation had not managed to reach. Not his Jedi training, which the poison had systematically undermined. Not his connection to the light side, which the months of sustained dark side exposure had blurred past the point of reliable contact. What remained was rage, pure and hot and entirely his own. The rage of someone who had tried to do right by the people he was protecting and had been destroyed for the trying. The rage of someone who had done everything the Order asked and had been given in return a slow, methodical unmaking. That rage was the thing the Krath had accidentally preserved while they dismantled everything else. And it was the thing that drove him toward the signal. Yavin 4 was broadcasting to the dark side awareness he had not possessed before the Krath, and could not turn off now. He did not know what was on Yavin 4. He knew the direction. He followed it. Kun was waiting in the great temple when Qel-Droma arrived, standing in the chamber where the Massassi ritual had changed what he was, the golden mask covering his expression, and the dark side radiating from him in the way it radiated from things that had absorbed enough of it to become continuous sources rather than just practitioners. He looked at the man who had walked into his temple and saw exactly what he had sent for. Not the Jedi who had gone into the Krath. Not the compromised and corrupted version the Krath had tried to build from the ruin of that Jedi. Something more useful than either of those things. Someone who had been through enough that the person they had been before was genuinely gone, and the person they were becoming did not yet have a defined shape. Raw material, the best and most dangerous kind. Keldroma looked at the man in the golden mask and felt the dark side radiating from the temples in waves, and felt his own connection to it thrumming in response, and understood that he was either about to find something or be consumed by it. He was not in a state to much care. The duel that broke out between them was not planned by either party in the way most duels are planned. It emerged from the encounter the way fire emerges from certain conditions. Two beings of enormous force ability in close proximity, both saturated with dark side energy, both carrying the particular volatility of people who have recently been changed by events they did not fully control, both watching the other with the assessment of practitioners who knew that in their tradition power was the only credential that meant anything. The assessment had to be tested. There was no other way to conduct it that would produce information both of them could trust. They were evenly matched in the specific, infuriating way that two people who have both been training at the edge of their capacity are evenly matched. Different in technique and in the character of their dark side connection. Kuhn's cold and deliberate and ancient in its methodology, Keldroma's hot and reactive and shaped by the particular damage of someone whose light side foundation had been burned out from under him rather than abandoned, but equivalent in the outcome their abilities were producing. Neither was getting through the other's defense. Neither was finding the opening. The chamber filled with the crack of lightsaber engagement and the pressure of force techniques deployed and deflected, and the particular quality of two very talented practitioners discovering simultaneously that they have met someone at their level, and then the chamber filled with something else. The spirit of Marka Ragnos entered the space, the way very old and very powerful presences enter spaces, without announcement and without effort, simply there where it had not been before, radiating the accumulated weight of everything the greatest Dark Lord of a Sith Empire, at its peak, had accumulated in a lifetime of absolute power, cold and enormous and entirely certain of its authority. It had been watching. It had been watching for longer than either of them had been alive. It had seen what each of them was, and it had made an assessment of what that combination represented, and it had waited for exactly this moment, this duel, to make itself known. It stopped them both without touching them, not through force technique, through presence. The quality of awareness that filled the chamber was so far beyond the normal scale of what Kuhn and Keldroma were generating that both of them felt it as a physical fact rather than a force perception. Something was here that made everything else in the room smaller by comparison. Both of them went still simultaneously and looked at what was there and understood, without requiring explanation, what they were looking at. Marka Ragnos had not survived death the way Frieden Nad had survived it. As a spirit bound to specific locations by the anchors of artifacts and unfinished business, he had survived it the way the very greatest accumulations of dark side power survive, as something that was part of the tradition itself now, woven into the fabric of what the Sith lineage was at its deepest level. He spoke, and what he communicated bypassed language in the way that things communicate when the beings they are communicating with are finally developed enough to receive direct transmission. You are both correct about yourselves and wrong about each other. This one, pointing his awareness at Kun, has the knowledge and the depth and the discipline. This one, pointing at Keldroma, has the connection and the feeling and the damage that makes a being capable of things that calculation alone cannot produce. What you cannot be separately, you can be together. The tradition does not need another individual practitioner who disappears into a temple and studies in isolation until the galaxy moves on past the point where studying matters. The tradition needs a war, an actual reckoning, something that the Republic and the Order cannot categorize as a local problem or an individual aberration, something that requires them to confront the fact that the tradition they have been pretending is finished is not finished, has never been finished, is standing in front of them now and asking them to look at what they have been refusing to look at for centuries. There was a specific gesture, a mark placed on Keldroma's forehead in the dark side, tradition's most ancient manner of formalizing the relationship it was formalizing, Dark Lord and apprentice. Not master and student in the provisional and always potentially dissolving sense that Jedi tradition used for that relationship. Something older and more binding. A declaration that these two beings were now structurally connected in the framework of the tradition that Ragnos represented, and that both of them were now standing inside in a way that could not be stepped out of. The spirit of Marka Ragnos dissolved back into the dark side atmosphere of the temple. The mark was on Keldroma's forehead. Exar Kun looked at his apprentice and felt the structure of what the tradition had just made them, and understood immediately and completely what came next. Not in terms of strategy. He already had the strategy. In terms of what this moment meant. The Brotherhood of the Sith had just been founded, not as an aspiration or a theory or a historical reconstruction of something that had existed and been destroyed, as a living fact, as a thing that existed in the galaxy right now and was going to begin making itself known to everyone who had spent centuries assuming it was gone. He told his apprentice what the war was going to look like. The Krath were already Keldromas. The dark side cult that had taken him and used him had in the process of doing so given him influence over it that survived his departure because the Krath's leadership understood, with the instinct of people who had been operating in dark side traditions long enough to develop good instincts about power, that Ulik Keldroma, even damaged and altered by his months in their care, was something they did not want as an enemy when they could keep him as an ally. The Mandalorians required acquisition by a different method, honor-bound warrior culture, challenge and combat, and the particular contract of obligation that Mandalorian tradition held as binding above all other forms of agreement. Keldroma went to Quaskilum and challenged Mandalore the Indomitable to single combat and won. And the tens of thousands of Mandalorian warriors who served under that name came with the victory, the way they always came with victories against their leaders, because that was how the contract worked. You earned what you took in a fair fight. The galaxy had not had a force of this size and this composition since the old Sith Empire's armies had marched under the Dark Lords. Krath cultists and Masasi warriors and Mandalorian veterans and the converted Jedi who were still in the process of being converted, flowing toward the Brotherhood's structure from every direction that the dark side had been quietly working in since Kun had established his temple on Yavin 4, and the Jedi, He had known from the beginning that the Jedi were both the primary obstacle and the primary resource. They were the obstacle because they were the only force in the galaxy with the training and the Force connection to potentially stop what the Brotherhood was becoming. They were the resource because many of them were exactly what he had been in Dantooine's training halls. Gifted, ambitious, genuinely powerful, sitting inside the code's structure and feeling the walls every single day and not knowing what was on the other side of those walls, because the Order had done everything in its institutional power to ensure they would never find out. He knew exactly what was waiting in those beings. He had been one of them. He knew what the walls felt like from the inside. He knew what someone needed to say to the person feeling those walls to make them consider, genuinely consider, opening a door. He went to Coruscant personally for this, not through intermediaries or communications or the converted agents already embedded in various Jedi postings around the Republic himself. In the Jedi Temple, standing in the training halls he had never attended, but that were recognizable to him through the tradition they were built to serve. The same structure and philosophy expressed in a different location. He stood in front of the apprentices and knights who gathered to see who had arrived and what they wanted, and he talked to them in the specific way that can only be done by someone who genuinely understood what they were feeling and was not performing understanding. He told them the truth about what the code was hiding. Not the dramatic version of that truth, the accurate one. The Force is more than you have been shown. The tradition that has been sealed away from you contains methodologies and understandings and techniques that your training has left gaps where they should be, and you have felt those gaps every time you reached for something in the Force and found the approved techniques could not reach it. Every time the code's walls stopped you at the edge of something you could feel but were not permitted to pursue. He described the dark side, not as the Jedi curriculum described it, as corruption and aberration, but as a methodology, a different answer to the same primary question the Jedi had also answered. He was not here to recruit them into evil. He was here to tell them that the evil they had been taught to fear was a category constructed by the winning side of an ancient argument, and that the reality was more complicated and more interesting and more available than they had been led to believe. Some of them were not moved. The ones whose relationship with the code was genuine rather than institutional, who had found in the Jedi framework the peace and purpose it was designed to offer, and who had built real lives around that finding. They heard what Kuhn was saying and understood it as something to be resisted and resisted it. He did not push them. He was not interested in resistance. He was interested in the ones who did not resist, the ones who leaned forward when he spoke, the ones whose faces changed in the specific way that faces change when something is named accurately that has been going unnamed for a long time. There were more of them than the Order's leadership would have been comfortable admitting. Those ones he took. He taught them what he had learned, through the fragments and through Korriban, and through the ritual on Yavin 4, condensed and adapted for transmission at speed, rather than the years of careful work that had built his own understanding. He did not have years. He had the weeks the war would give him before the Order understood enough of what was happening to begin organizing an effective response. So he gave them what they needed in the time available, and he sent them back to their temples, back to their masters, back to the structures they had come from, back to sit inside those structures with what he had given them, and to wait for the signal he told them he would send when the time came. He returned to Yavin 4 and began the war. The signal, when it came, was felt simultaneously by every being he had converted across the galaxy. Not a communication in the ordinary sense, a dark side transmission that reached the specific force awareness he had touched and altered in each of them, calling the new thing he had built in them to act on what it had been built to do, across dozens of worlds simultaneously, on the same night, in the same hours. The converted apprentices and knights rose from their beds or their meditation chambers or wherever they were, and went to their masters, the ones who had trained them, the ones who had cared for them, the ones who had given them the framework the Order had built around every Force-sensitive being it had ever taken in. The framework that he had spent weeks showing them was a cage. The Jedi Order's masters died in their sleep. Across dozens of worlds on the same night, the people who had given the most of themselves to the institution they served were killed by the people they had most trusted, by the bonds of training and mentorship turned into the mechanism of destruction with a precision that only someone who understood exactly how those bonds functioned could have engineered. This was not a military attack. It was something worse. It was the careful and deliberate weaponization of the Order's most fundamental values. The Jedi gave everything to their students. That gift, in the night the signal went out, became the thing that killed them. The Order did not understand immediately what had happened. The simultaneous nature of it was precisely what made it incomprehensible at first. Deaths in isolated postings look like individual tragedies. Isolated incidents of fallen apprentices or local violence, or the 100 other specific and explicable things that deaths in isolated postings can be. It took time for the pattern to reach the Council, and in the time it took the pattern to reach the Council, the broader campaign had already launched, and the Republic was already fighting on fronts it had not prepared for because it had not believed it needed to prepare. Keldroma and the Mandalorian forces hit military targets and Republic infrastructure. Krath operatives moved in civilian networks. The Massassi warriors garrisoned Yavin 4 and moved through the outer rim systems closest to it. The Brotherhood's strategy was not to conquer the Republic in the conventional sense of taking and holding territory. It was to make the Republic understand that the thing it had believed was historical was present and operational. To replace the assumption of safety with the recognition of genuine and immediate danger, to break the comfortable institutional confidence that had allowed the Order and the Senate to treat the Sith tradition as a museum exhibit rather than a living force. They were succeeding. The Republic was not ready for a multi-front, simultaneous engagement by a force combining Mandalorian military capacity with dark side force abilities with coordinated insider sabotage. The Council was not ready to process the scale of what was happening to its own structure while also directing the military response to the larger campaign. Everything was moving too fast and in too many directions simultaneously for the standard institutional responses to keep up with it. Kun moved through all of it with the cold efficiency of someone executing a plan they have been thinking about for a very long time. He was not reactive. He did not respond to the Republic's countermoves with countermoves of his own. He continued the plan. The plan accounted for the Republic's capacity to respond and had already determined what responses were possible and which of those possible responses could be absorbed and which needed to be redirected before they became effective. He was playing at a depth that the Republic's military leadership was not equipped to match. Not because its leadership was incompetent, but because the kind of thinking that produced the Brotherhood's strategy was the kind that years of Sith study and the full current of the dark side tradition running through you at all times produced, and the Republic had no equivalent. Coruscant, was the moment that made the war undeniable. He walked into the Senate while it was in full session. Not disguised, not hidden. The dark side was radiating from him in a way that any Force-sensitive being in the building would have felt. From the moment he entered the structure, the golden mask and the Sith weapons and the everything he was communicating in the simplest possible terms to anyone with the capacity to read it. This was not an infiltration, it was a statement. He was here, in the Republic's center. In the room where the galaxy's government made its decisions. He was here, and he was not afraid. And he wanted everyone in the room to understand why. The Jedi present responded first, which was the appropriate order of response. They moved to contain the threat, activating the training that had been built into them through years of curriculum, forming the tactical disposition that the Order taught for situations involving a single, powerful, dark side practitioner in a civilian environment. They were good. They were very well trained. It was not enough. He did not fight through them the way a lesser practitioner would have fought through them. He went around what they were doing. The Sith sorcery techniques the Korriban tombs had transmitted were not lightsaber combat forms. They were something older and less discussed in Jedi curricula, for the very specific reason that the Order's combat methodology had no established counter to them. Force techniques built on dark side principles so old that most of the Order's masters had never encountered anything like them in operational conditions, only in theoretical accounts stripped of the specific details that made them dangerous to know about. He deployed them now in the specific conditions they had been built for, against the kind of institutional military formation that had not encountered the methodology before and had no practiced response to fall back on. The senators saw things they did not have frameworks for. They heard and felt things that the architecture of a room built for governance was not designed to contain. The Jedi who had moved to stop him were occupied with things that were not him while he moved through the room. The Supreme Chancellor was at the center of the chamber, elevated in the traditional position of authority, surrounded by the trappings of the Republic's 10,000 years of institutional legitimacy. He looked at what was coming toward him and understood what was happening and did not have time to finish understanding it. The Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic died in the Senate chamber, while the full representation of the Republic's government watched and could not stop it. This was the point. Not the Chancellor's death specifically, though that was useful. The point was the demonstration. The point was making the Republic understand, in the most direct possible terms, that there was no safe room. That the assumption of safety inside institutional spaces was itself a construction that the Brotherhood had just demonstrated was exactly as durable as any other construction when the right force was applied to it. The walls of the Republic's confidence had been tested, and they had come down. Kel Droma's capture came shortly afterward, and Kun's appearance at the trial was the kind of thing that produces the specific quality of institutional trauma that lasts for generations. The senators who were in the chamber for the trial understood, watching what he did to free his apprentice, that everything they had believed about the limits of what a single individual could do inside their institutions needed to be revised downward. That the walls they had trusted were not the walls they had thought. He paralyzed the Senate chamber. He freed Kel Droma. He walked out. The Republic had nothing to stop him from walking out. The weapon was the next instrument of demonstration. Naga Sado's old battleship, recovered through the Sith, knowledge that told Kun where to look and what to look for, carried technology from the earliest era of Sith expansion. Technology the Sith Empire at its peak had developed for the specific purpose of making entire star systems Understand that resistance had consequences beyond the conventional, consequences of a geological scale, the kind that rearranged the fundamental conditions of the local universe rather than just the political or military situation within it. The Chron cluster, 10 stars in relatively close proximity, sitting near the system that housed Ossus, the great library world of the Jedi Order. Ossus was what the Order most valued, that was not a living person. Millennia of accumulated knowledge. Holocrons containing the teachings of masters who had been dead for centuries. Texts recording the understanding of the greatest Jedi practitioners in the history of the tradition. Artifacts whose significance went beyond the material into what they represented about the continuity of knowledge across generations. The Jedi put enormous effort and resources into maintaining Ossus, because Ossus was the proof of the Order's own continuity. It said, in the language of physical preservation, that the tradition was real and permanent, and had been real and permanent for long enough that it needed a world to hold what it had accumulated. He set the Chron cluster's stars going nova. Not one star, 10. The resulting chain reaction produced a shockwave that moved through the system with a particular totality of stellar forces operating at stellar scale. Ossus had hours, not days, hours, in which to attempt to evacuate whatever it was possible to evacuate from a repository of knowledge that had taken millennia to assemble. The Jedi deployed everything they had to the evacuation, committing resources from across their organization to the impossible task of making meaningful decisions about what was irreplaceable enough to carry out and what had to be left for the wave. He arrived at Ossus while the evacuation was underway. Not to stop the evacuation, to take what the evacuation was revealing. The Jedi were making choices under extreme time pressure about what to carry and what to leave. And those choices were also choices about what was where and what was accessible. He moved through the library in the chaos of the evacuation and took what the dark side pointed him toward. Artifacts, holocrons, texts, the specific items from the Order's collection that had the most significance to the Sith tradition, either because they were Sith artifacts the Order had captured and stored, or because they contained records of Sith history and technique that the Order had been keeping in the deepest sections of the archive, away from students and away from anyone who might follow what the texts were pointing toward. He took these things and he watched the Jedi run, and he understood that the war had reached its crest. Vodo Siosk Bas was at Coruscant when Kun and Keldroma were leaving the Senate chamber with the Chancellor's death still present in the room. The old Kravaki master had come to petition the Senate about the Sith attacks. He had been in the Republic's capital trying to do through institutional channels what the Brotherhood was demonstrating could not be done through institutional channels. He had come to petition. His former student had come to demonstrate. They found each other in the corridor of the Senate building. And for a moment, the space between them was occupied entirely by history, by the years on Dantooine and the conversations in the evening and the warnings that Vodo had given and the particular patience he had maintained through a student who absorbed everything at speed and came back looking hungry and asked, what came next? By the relationship that the master title implied, which was not just technical instruction but something more, a kind of care, a genuine investment in what this specific being was going to become. Vodo had put that investment into Exar Kun for years, had maintained it through every sign that the direction was wrong, had held out the possibility of being wrong about his assessment longer than most masters would have held it, because that was what patience of that depth required. The student he had invested in was standing in front of him in a golden mask, with the full current of the dark side tradition running through him, and a war halfway to winning in his ledger, and the Chancellor's death barely minutes old. Vodo tried to bring him back. This is the thing that needs to be said first about what happened in the corridor of the Senate building. The master, who had spent years watching his student move toward the edge, tried one more time, in the worst possible conditions, with the least possible hope of it working, to do the thing that masters who care about their students do when they see them at the bottom of the worst decision of their lives. He talked to him. He reached through everything that had happened and everything that Kun had become and tried to find whatever was left of the student who had been given everything the order could offer and had decided it was not enough. He was not naive about the odds. He knew the odds. He tried anyway, because not trying, in the face of what he was looking at, was something he was constitutionally incapable of. Kun answered him with the weapon he had built on Yavin 4. The double-bladed lightsaber was not an accident of design. It was a statement in hardware, a weapon that the standard Jedi lightsaber forms had not been built around countering because the standard Jedi lightsaber forms had not anticipated this specific combination of technique and tradition and willingness. Vodo was an exceptional duelist. He had been fighting and teaching fighting for centuries. His technique was impeccable, and his force connection was deep, and the weapon he carried, his thin, elegant staff, was something he had used in 1,000 training encounters and actual engagements over the long course of his life. It was not enough. Not because Vodo fought poorly. He did not fight poorly. He fought at the level of someone who had spent centuries mastering the thing they were doing. It was not enough because the being he was fighting had been built by the Jedi Order's own training into something that the Order's training had not accounted for when it was deciding what to build. Everything the curriculum had given Kun, every form and technique and force application the years on Dantooine had developed, had been absorbed and extended and redirected through the full depth of the Sith dark side tradition. He was fighting a version of the Jedi system he had created. The master who had taught him the Foundation was fighting the thing the Foundation had been used to build. Those are not equal positions. Vodo Siosk Bas died on the floor of the Senate building's corridor. His student killed him with a weapon his student had built. This was the moment that completed Kun's transformation in the specific sense that the transformation was now absolute. Not in the sense that he had not been fully committed before. He had been fully committed since the ritual on Yavin 4. But there are things that can only be done once, and that, once done, remove a possibility permanently. Killing his master was one of those things. It is not that Vodo alive had been a meaningful impediment. He was not. It is that Vodo alive had been the last living connection to the thing Kun had been before the fragments, and Dizun and Korriban and Yavin 4. The last person in the galaxy who remembered the student who had been given everything and had looked at everything and found it insufficient. With Vodo dead, that person was also dead. In the only way a person can be dead, when they have already physically survived their own transition permanently, without remainder. He felt nothing about this that the dark side would have recognized as grief. He filed it in the same category as everything else the war was producing. Information, consequence, movement toward the outcome the plan was designed to produce. The war began to change, not in the way wars change when the winning side makes mistakes. In the way wars change when the balance of something underneath the fighting shifts. Kel Droma killed his brother Kay at Ossus, and the act of fratricide broke something in him that the Krath poison and the months of manipulation and the dark side conversion had not managed to break, because those things had operated on the parts of him that were connected to his Jedi training and his institutional commitments and his strategic thinking, the parts that the dark side had methodically worked at. What the fratricide reached was the part that was not connected to any of those things. The part that had existed before the Order and before the training and before any of the frameworks that had shaped him into a Jedi Knight. The simple and pre-rational and entirely irreducible recognition that he had killed his brother. Not an enemy, not a target, his brother. Kay Keldroma, who had remained loyal when Ulic fell, who had tried to reach him when reaching him was impossible, who had never stopped treating his fallen brother as someone worth trying to save. Nomi Sunrider was there when Keldroma's dark side connection faltered in the wake of the fratricide, and she used the technique she had developed through her own relationship with the Force, the capacity to reach into another being's Force connection and sever it. Not damage it, not diminish it. Sever it completely and permanently, the way a surgeon removes rather than treats. Keldroma went from full dark side immersion to complete Force blindness in the space of a moment. And the Force blindness was permanent, and the war lost its second leader in the same confrontation that broke his soul. Kun learned what had happened on Ossus. He filed it. He continued. But the filing was different now. The calculation that had been running continuously since he left Dantooine, the assessment of the situation against the plan, the ongoing monitoring of what was working and what required adjustment, that calculation was producing results that the plan had not accounted for in quite the specific ways. It was not accounting for them. The Mandalorian military capacity had been substantial and was now diminished. The Krath's operational effectiveness was degraded by Keldroma's absence from leadership. The converted Jedi who had murdered their masters on that single night were not, as a group, equivalent to the masters they had murdered. And the Order's response, though delayed by the scale and simultaneity of what had happened to it, was the response of an institution that had survived existential threats before and had built institutional memory about how to survive them. The Republic was still standing. The Order was damaged and grieving, and in the process of urgent reorganization, but it was standing, and it was moving. Now, toward Yavin 4, with the kind of unified intention that institutions only achieve when the alternative to unity is extinction. He knew they were coming. He knew approximately when they would arrive. He knew, with the clarity of someone who had been calculating the variables of this situation from the beginning, that the force they were bringing was more than the Massassi and his own power could defend against in a conventional military engagement. He was not interested in a conventional military engagement. He had never been interested in anything conventional. Conventional thinking was what the walls of the code were built from. He had walked through those walls years ago and had not looked back since. The ritual he had been studying for exactly this contingency was not in the Jedi archive fragments. It was not in anything the Order had access to. It was in the deepest sections of the Korriban knowledge the ancient spirits had transmitted. The part of the transmission that had arrived at the end, when the spirits were finishing rather than beginning, when they were giving the things they had saved for the version of their student who had demonstrated they could receive them. The survival technique, the method by which a practitioner of sufficient dark side development could, in extremis, sever their consciousness from the specific biological structure carrying it, and anchor that consciousness instead to the dark side energy of a location deep enough and old enough to hold it. You could not die in the conventional sense if you did this. you also could not live in the conventional sense. What you became was something the tradition had a name for, and the Jedi curriculum did not, because the Jedi curriculum had no vocabulary for something it had never encountered and had no interest in developing the vocabulary to describe. You became a presence, anchored to a place, still aware, still capable of reaching out to the Force-sensitive beings who came near enough to reach, still, in a specific and important sense, exactly what you had been, just no longer resident in the physical system that biology provided and death in the conventional sense dissolved. He looked at his options and selected the one that preserved the most of what mattered. The Massassi came to him. All of them. Every member of the community that had served the dark side tradition for generations, that had been shaped by Naga Sado's ancient conditioning into exactly this function, that had been kneeling to the dark side's inheritors since before anyone now alive was born. They came to him in the great temple, and they arranged themselves in the ritual pattern that they knew in their bones, because the knowing was in their bones, woven into the Massassi community's deepest cultural memory. They had always been here for this. This was what they had been preserved for across the centuries. Not to serve a Dark Lord indefinitely as his workforce or his army. To serve this, the culminating ritual, the thing the tradition required from them at the end of a Dark Lord's physical existence. The sacrifice that would carry that existence forward past the physical into the thing the tradition had prepared for. He looked at them. He understood what he was looking at. These were beings who had served him faithfully and who were now arranging themselves to die for him, and who understood this and accepted it the way a river accepts the sea, not with resignation, with the deep and structural rightness of something fulfilling its purpose. He had no feelings about this, that the dark side tradition would have recognized as ambivalence. The tradition did not produce ambivalence about the tools it used. Tools were for using. What the Massassi were for was this: the dark side energy that had been accumulating in the temple stones for millennia concentrated as the ritual began. The Massassi chanting was not language in the conventional sense. It was vibration. It was the specific frequency of sustained dark side intention communicated through the biological systems of beings conditioned to produce exactly that frequency, directed at the structure of the temple that had been built to receive and amplify it. The energy built the way storms build, not through addition of discrete amounts, but through the self-amplifying process of dark side force energy, responding to dark side force energy. Each increment of accumulation making the next increment easier, faster, larger, and he used it. The entire accumulated life force of the Massassi people, pulled from them through the ritual, in the specific direction the technique required, poured into the mechanism of his own transition from the biological to the spiritual. He felt himself separate from the body that had carried him from Dantooine to Dexun to Korriban to here, with a clarity that no description from the Korriban tradition had fully prepared him for. The body was still there, still breathing, still present in the physical chamber. But he was no longer resident in it the way he had been. He was resident in something larger, in the dark side energy of the temple itself, distributed through stone that had been built to hold exactly this, specific to this location, in the way that ghosts are specific to the places they haunt, except that this was not haunting in the passive sense. This was occupation. This was the dark side tradition, making a home in the place it had always been building a home. Through all the centuries of Sith practice that had saturated these stones, He felt the Republic's fleet arriving in orbit. He felt the Jedi Force on those ships gathering themselves for the technique they had developed to counter what he had done. He felt the Wall of Light building, hundreds of Jedi, combining their Force connections into a single unified pressure applied against the dark side concentration of the temple from above and from outside. He felt what it was and what it was intended to do, and he felt his own anchoring in the stones responding to it. The collision was not a combat in any conventional sense. It was two enormous force concentrations pressing against each other across the boundary between a location and the space around it, between a dark side anchor and the light side technique designed to dissolve it. The firestorm that resulted was both of them interacting at the edge of what force energy does when it meets its equivalent opposite at sufficient magnitude. It moved across the moon's surface the way geological events move, with the indifference of the scale involved to anything that happened to be in the path. His body burned with everything else on the surface. He was not in his body. He was in the stones. He was in the temple. He was in the accumulated dark side energy of a location that the Wall of Light had pressed against, with everything hundreds of Jedi had to give and had not dissolved, had instead driven deeper, had compressed the dark side anchor into something denser and more interior and less accessible than it had been when it was distributed through the surface of the stones, sealing it in the way that you can seal a fire by cutting off its oxygen and making it burn inward rather than out. The Wall of Light had not destroyed him. It had imprisoned him. And the difference between destruction and imprisonment was the entire difference between a conclusion and a continuation. The Jedi left Yavin 4 believing the war was over. They were right about the war. They were wrong about Exar Kun. He was there, in the stones, in the dark side energy that the Wall of Light had compressed into the deep structure of the temple, still aware, still himself, in all the specific ways that mattered to him, still in possession of everything the ritual and Korriban and Disun and years of dedicated pursuit had given him, unable to act in the conventional sense of action, unable to move through the galaxy or to engage with the physical world in the way that a body permits, but present, waiting, with the cold and geological patience of the tradition that had produced him, for the conditions that would change the calculus of imprisonment, for a being with force sensitive enough to reach and raw enough to be reached. For whoever came to Yavin 4 next, the years passed. The Order rebuilt under Nomi Sunrider and relocated to Coruscant and trained new knights to replace the ones that the war had taken. And the names of the Great Sith War's participants moved from living record into history and eventually into the kind of history that feels distant enough to be safe. The Republic recovered. Systems that had been damaged, rebuilt. The wounds the Brotherhood had made in the Republic's confidence about its own safety gradually scarred over, not healed exactly, but covered by the new tissue of enough time and enough ordinary governance and enough of the daily work of running a civilization to put what had happened into a context that made it feel like the past rather than the present. Mandalore the Indomitable was dead, replaced by Mandalore the Ultimate, who would eventually produce his own threat. Ulic Qel-Droma wandered in the force blindness Nomi Sunrider had imposed on him, carrying the weight of what he had done without the force connection that had been the context of his entire adult life, trying to find whatever redemption a being who had done what he had done could find when the tools he had always used to navigate were gone. He found some of it, not enough of it. He died years later on an icy world, shot by a young man who did not know who he was, and the Force took him in the way the Force takes the broken things it finally reclaims, quietly and without ceremony. In the temples of Yavin 4, the dark side energy held, and the presence in the stones held within it, and the jungle grew over everything, and the Masasi were gone, and the war was history, and the centuries accumulated on the surface of the moon with the patient disinterest of time operating at the geological scale. He waited. The new Jedi Order arrived on Yavin 4, not in the era of the Old Republic, but in the era after the Empire. Luke Skywalker chose the temples for his academy, not despite their history, but in some part because of it. The dark side energy he could feel in the stones was real, and he understood that it was real, and his decision to put his academy here was the decision of someone who believed that the appropriate response to darkness was to bring light into the spaces where it lived, rather than to step around those spaces and pretend the darkness would stay contained. He was not wrong about this as a general principle. He was not wrong about his own capacity to maintain the light side presence that had defeated the Emperor and turned Darth Vader back to the man he had been before the dark side took him. He was not fully wrong about Yavin 4. What he was the first Force-sensitive being of genuine development to come to the temples in 4,000 years. And the presence in the stones had been waiting, with the patience of something that has no other options and no constraints on the duration of its patience, for exactly that. It did not move immediately. The dark side tradition was patient. 4,000 years of imprisonment had not changed the fundamental calculating nature of the being in the stones. It assessed the new arrival's strength, the quality of his light side connection, the breadth of what he had accomplished, the depth of his Force ability. It assessed the students he was bringing to the temples. It examined the composition of the group, the relative development of each of them, the ones who were further along and the ones who were newer and more open and more raw, the ones for whom the training they were receiving was still in the process of settling into the stable configuration it would eventually form. One of them was different from the others. Not in development, in character. Kype Duron had come to the academy from the Empire's spice mines, from the specific and thorough kind of damage that the Empire administered to political prisoners it wanted to make examples of rather than kill, from years in conditions designed to break the human capacity for hope and dignity and forward orientation. He had survived. He had maintained enough of himself in those conditions to feel the Force still pressing at the edges of his awareness, the connection that the Empire's brutality had not been able to fully suppress, and he had come out the other side of it with the particular quality of someone who has survived the unsurvivable and knows it. Powerful beyond most of his peers at the academy. Angry with the specific deep anger of someone who has been very badly wronged by a system that did not answer for what it did. Full of the desire to do something with the power the Force had given him that matched the scale of what had been done to him and to everyone like him. The presence in the stones recognized what it was, looking at the way it had recognized Ulic Keldroma across the galaxy 4,000 years ago. Not with warmth, with the specific focus of a predator that has identified exactly the prey it was designed to hunt. The approach was not abrupt. Nothing about the dark side tradition was abrupt when patience was available. It was a quality of the dreams first. The kinds of dreams that Force-sensitive beings have that are not entirely separable from Force vision, pressing at the edges of Kype Duron's sleeping awareness with images and feelings that did not announce their source. Old things, ancient things, the sense of tremendous power waiting in the stones that surrounded the dormitory where the students slept. The particular feeling of limitlessness that the dark side offered to beings who had been very specifically and very deliberately limited by circumstances and were ready, at a bone-deep level, to be done with limitation. Then voices. In the specific moments when Kip was alone in the older sections of the temple, when the other students were elsewhere, and the instruction was paused and the silence of the jungle pressed in around the ancient stones, voices. Not from outside, from the stones themselves, from the dark side energy that had been in those stones for 4,000 years and was using his force sensitivity as the interface it needed to have the conversation it had been waiting to have. He offered what the tradition always offered: power, knowledge, the specific understanding of the force that the Jedi curriculum did not teach and that the dark side tradition had accumulated across millennia. He offered it in the voice of someone who understood exactly what Kip Duran needed to hear, in exactly the terms that would reach him, because what was in the stones had spent 4,000 years of enforced stillness, doing the one thing that an imprisoned intelligence with force sensitivity and nobody can do, which is feel the living force of the galaxy, pressing against the boundary of its containment, and read everything in that pressing. He knew the texture of damage before he had finished hearing about it. He knew the shape of what Kip needed in the first moments of contact. Luke felt something wrong in the Force, in the way that very developed practitioners feel things wrong without having precise information about the specific nature of the wrongness. He felt his students' dreams becoming strange. He felt the dark side energy in the stones, doing something that it had not been doing since his arrival, something more active than passive presence, something reaching rather than simply existing. He felt Kip Duran moving towards something in the older sections of the temple at hours when the students were supposed to be resting. He tried to reach his student and found the reaching increasingly met with something that was not Kip Duran's resistance and was not Kip Duran's force signature, but was layered over both of those things in the way that an affection layers over the normal function of the systems it is inhabiting. He went to the stones himself, and in the deep silence of the oldest chamber, he felt what was there with everything. His force ability and his long experience with darkness allowed him to feel. And what he felt was vast and cold and very old, and entirely uninterested in the presence of Luke Skywalker, in the way that things are uninterested in the things they have already assessed and categorized and found insufficient to prevent what they are doing. Kip Duran left Yavin 4 with the knowledge the presence in the stones had given him, and with the Sun Crusher, the superweapon he had used that knowledge to access and acquire. He used it. He destroyed systems. He killed people who had no relationship to what had been done to him in the spice mines. People who were simply in the systems the Sun Crusher consumed when the weapon did what it had been built to do. People whose deaths were the demonstration that the anger Kip Duran was running on was not a precise tool, and that the power he had been given was not being used with anything resembling the precision the being who gave it to him was capable of applying. Luke tracked his student. Luke found him. The confrontation between them was not a lightsaber duel in the conventional sense. It was a force engagement at the level of fundamental orientation. Luke attempting to reach past the dark side conditioning that had overlaid Kip Duran's own force signature and touch whatever was still Kip's own. Kip unable to feel that reaching clearly because the thing in the stones had built a wall between the student and anyone trying to pull him back toward who he had been before the temples got into him. Luke went into a force coma in the engagement, and his body lay still on the ship while his spirit went somewhere else. He did not give up. He gathered what the Force gave him from the other side of the boundary that the coma created between his physical state and his Force awareness, and he pushed back, and the pushing back had the quality that Luke Skywalker's pushing back always had, which was not the quality of someone fighting against something, but the quality of someone insisting on something more fundamental than what the darkness was insisting on. Kyp Durron came back. Not all at once, and not cleanly, and not without the weight of what he had done in the time the presence in the stones had been directing him, sitting on him in a way that would sit on him for the rest of his life. But he came back. He helped put the Sun Crusher beyond use. He became, in time, one of the finer members of Luke's Jedi Order, someone whose understanding of what the dark side was, and what it did to people, and what it required from the beings it used, was built from the inside, rather than from the theoretical accounts the curriculum provided. He was useful because of what had happened to him as much as despite it. That irony was not lost on him. The presence in the stones watched Kyp Durron leave and felt the attempt it had made at expansion fail in the way it failed, and recalculated with the patience of something that has been miscalculating for 4,000 years and has learned through the accumulation of failed recalculations that the failure mode of patience is not that it runs out. The failure mode of patience is that eventually the conditions that end it come not from outside the patient thing, but from the thing being patient itself. Luke came back to Yavin 4 with his students and with the full understanding of what lived in the stones, and with the specific intention that the being in the stones had been avoiding thinking about because thinking about it required conceding that the condition of being in the stones was itself a vulnerability rather than an advantage. The students arranged themselves in the configuration that Luke directed, around the temple's perimeter and through its interior spaces, their individual force connections forming a network that the entity in the stones had not encountered before and had not been built to counter. Not a wall of light, in the sense that Nomi Sunrider's technique had been a wall of light. Something different, something that used the specific capability of this specific group of people, the warm collective force presence of a community of practitioners who were connected to each other through the bond of shared training and shared purpose, and the genuine care that Luke's approach to teaching had produced between them. He had told them what they were facing. He had told them what it had done. He had told them its history, the full arc of it, from the hungry student on Dantooine to the golden mask on Yavin 4, to the war it had built, and the people it had used, and the ritual at the end that had made the stones, the prison that contained it now. He had not minimized any of it. He did not believe in minimizing darkness as a strategy for helping people face it. He believed in accurate information and the specific kind of courage that accurate information, fully received, could produce in beings who chose to receive it. The students received it. They held the configuration Luke had described, and they poured into it the thing that the dark side tradition in the stones had no counter to. Not power, not technique, not ancient knowledge carefully preserved across millennia of careful study. Love. The genuine variety, the kind that the Jedi Code in its formal version had always struggled to fully describe. The kind that Luke's practice of the Force had been building a vocabulary for through his entire career. The warm, collective insistence of beings who cared about each other and about the galaxy and about the thing they were protecting, which was not the abstract concept of the light side, but the specific and concrete reality of the people and places and relationships that the light side existed to preserve. The presence in the stones felt this pressing against its containment and understood, with the cold and accurate intelligence that had always been its primary characteristic, that it was looking at the thing it had never successfully engaged with across the full span of its existence. Not because it hadn't encountered love, as a concept, because it had always treated love as a weakness to be exploited. The Krath had used Keldroma's love for the people he was trying to protect to corrupt him. The dark side tradition used emotional connection as a vector for control and manipulation, and the particular leverage that caring about something gives to anyone who wants to threaten that something. What the tradition had never produced was a genuine understanding of what love did when it was not being exploited, when it was just allowed to be what it was, when the beings producing it were doing so not strategically, but simply because that was what they were and how they related to the galaxy and the people in it. The calculation that had run continuously since Dantooine could not model this. The dark side tradition had no framework for it. The Korriban knowledge had nothing about it, because the beings who had produced the Korriban knowledge had understood power in every form except this one, which they had categorically, and by philosophical conviction, excluded from their understanding. The force presence in the stones felt the warm, collective insistence press against it from every direction simultaneously, and had nothing to press back with that, reached that register. Its power was real. Its knowledge was genuine and vast. The dark side energy in the stones was 4,000 years of accumulated force concentration. None of it was the right kind of thing. The right kind of thing was the thing pressing against it from the outside. The students of Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy, holding the configuration around the temple on Yavin 4, and not fighting the darkness with force technique, but simply insisting, with the collective weight of what they were and how they felt about each other and about the galaxy they were part of, that it was time. The dark side energy began to release, not in the way that walls release when force attacks them from outside, in the way that held breath releases when the holding finally ends. The thing in the stones had been holding for 4,000 years, and the holding was done. The stones let go of what they had been carrying, and what the stones let go of dispersed into the force in the way that things which have been resisting the force's long pull toward dissolution finally stop resisting. Not extinguished, not destroyed, released into the larger current, into the thing that everything eventually returns to when the individual will that has been holding a separate coherent shape can no longer maintain the energy cost of that separateness. Exar Kun, the Dark Lord of the Sith, the brilliant and cold and deliberate and catastrophically unlimited being who had looked at everything the galaxy could offer and found it insufficient, and had spent the subsequent decades proving that the insufficiency he felt was not in himself, but in the ceiling he had been given. The being who had built a war from texts and fragments and the dark side energy of a moon that wasn't even supposed to be on anyone's map. The being who had murdered his master in the corridor of the Senate building and had felt nothing that could be called grief. The being who had sacrificed every Massassi on Yavin 4 as a tool and had felt nothing that could be called regret. That being, in the warm, collective force of Luke Skywalker's students, came apart, not in pain. Exactly. The dark side tradition did not produce the capacity for pain of the kind that a dissolution should produce. If dissolution were the tragedy, the light side described it as what it produced in the final moments of coherent awareness was something closer to recognition. The recognition that the wanting had been the wrong unit of measurement all along. Not wrong because wanting was bad. Not wrong because the things wanted were unreal, or the power was an illusion, or the tradition was hollow. The power was real. The knowledge was genuine. The tradition was exactly what it claimed to be. Wrong, because wanting without end is not a relationship with the galaxy. It is a posture against it. And postures against the galaxy are, in the long run of enough centuries and enough accumulated consequences, the things that the galaxy is patient enough to wait out. The stones of Yavin 4 were quiet. The dark side energy in them was not gone entirely, because the history of what had been done in and to those stones could not be made into not history by the departure of the being who had done it. But the presence was gone. The cold intelligence that had waited 4,000 years for the right Force-sensitive being to come within reach was gone. The last practitioner of the dark side tradition that the Great Sith War had belonged to was finally, in the full and irreversible sense, gone. The jungle grew over everything. The stones absorbed the rain. The temples stood as they had stood for millennia, holding nothing now except history. The kind that takes a long time to forget and a longer time to understand, and that never quite stops being relevant to the people who inherit the galaxy that history made. Exar Kun had come close, closer than the history books that eventually recorded his war could fully convey, in the way that distance from any sufficient catastrophe makes the catastrophe feel more manageable in retrospect than it was in practice. He had taken the Jedi Order apart from the inside. He had killed its masters in their beds. He had stood in the Republic's government and ended its leader and walked out. He had set 10 stars going nova and watched an ancient library burn and taken what he wanted from the ashes. He had gotten further, from a single temple on a jungle moon, with nothing to start with except what he had been given in the Jedi curriculum and what he had found in sealed archives, and what the dark side tradition had transmitted to him through spirits and rituals, and 4,000 years of accumulated knowledge waiting in ancient stone than anyone in his generation had imagined was possible. He was also wrong about the most important thing. The thing he had been certain of from the very beginning of the journey that took him from Dantooine to here. The thing that the wanting had told him in the clear and confident voice of a mind so good at understanding things that it had difficulty distinguishing between understanding and certainty. He was wrong about the walls. The walls the Jedi Code built around its students were not, as he had concluded, cages designed to contain the power the Force offered and keep practitioners dependent on the institution's approval for access to what they could reach without it. They were something more complicated than that, something that required a different kind of understanding to see. Not the understanding of someone who had read every fragment and absorbed every tradition and processed everything the dark side had to offer at the speed of a mind built to process quickly. A slower kind, the kind that takes long enough to arrive that it looks, from certain angles, like it has not arrived at all. The Force is not just power. The Sith were right that the Jedi curriculum sometimes treated it as if restraint were the whole story. The Sith were wrong that power was the whole story either. What the Force is, in the deepest sense that 4,000 years of Sith knowledge and the full current of the dark side tradition and the cold genius of the greatest Dark Lord of his generation could not access, is relationship between beings, between those beings and the living galaxy they are part of, between the choices that individuals make and the consequences those choices produce for everyone who shares a galaxy with those individuals. The Force is what connects those things, not as a mechanism, as a fact of what the universe is at its most fundamental level. Exar Kun never learned this. He never had the patience for it. He was always moving too quickly toward what came next to stop long enough to understand what was already there. The jungle grew over the temples. The stars of the Kron cluster burned in the configuration that 10 nova explosions and the cooling of several thousand years had produced. The Jedi Order, in Luke Skywalker's era, rebuilt itself around the principles that the students on Yavin 4 had demonstrated in the moment of Kuhn's final dissolution. Not the absence of power, not the suppression of what the Force could do, the presence of relationship, the insistence on it. The decision to treat what connects beings to each other and to the galaxy they inhabit as the most fundamental Force reality, more fundamental than technique, more fundamental than tradition, more fundamental than the wanting that had driven one brilliant and cold and ultimately limited being from a training hall on Dantooine to a dark-side throne on a jungle moon, and through a war that reshaped the Republic, and finally into the stones of a temple where he waited 4,000 years for a second chance, that the Force, patient as the jungle and persistent as the light that eventually reaches even the deepest places in the oldest stones, eventually made into something other than what he had been planning. The stones were quiet. The jungle was old. The history was done. And somewhere in the Force, in the vast and impartial and endlessly patient current that carries everything that has ever been into whatever comes next, what remained of Exar Kun was no longer separate from it, no longer apart, no longer resisting, just part of the same enormous, ongoing thing that the wanting had always been trying to separate from, and failing, and trying again. That was always the only ending available to him. He just took longer than most to arrive at it.